But I just would like to ask the team in the kitchen to make less noise while serving, but obviously it's completely okay to use the amazing term food lab. So welcome everybody, here in the St. Agnes location of the Johann König Gallery. It's now the third consecutive day that we are holding here our Wellbeing Culture Forum. The weather is very nice with us. It's a beautiful blue sky. The sun is shining. There is a nice wind also that is touching the leaves of this tree that is with us on the stage. It's the very first time since March that we are doing this Wellbeing Culture Forum within a physical reality on a stage, but we merged it also with the virtual reality of Zoom that we all became so extremely used to, looking at people's faces on the LC displays. Now I'm extremely happy that that we can be here in a physical reality. Now the birds started also to sing, so it's really nice and shows us how important this is. The Wellbeing Culture Forum was and is and will be also in the future a response to COVID-19 and to everything what we had to learn through COVID-19, among others, that the way how our culture divided us from nature is not a sustainable way. This is basically the motto of these talks here, from breaking Bauhaus to growing Gaia. This was the first talk that we did on Friday, where we talked about the relevance of the Bauhaus movement for today's times. The Bauhaus movement was a cultural movement that was able to recreate the world because of a cultural agenda that wanted to fix the insufficiencies and injustices of the times around 1919 when it started. It was after the Spanish flu 1917. It was after the First World War. It was in time of a crisis. Yesterday we talked then about the topic creating in crisis together with Roya Sachs, and it was a talk exactly about labors and publications pillars. Monilola Ilupetru takes a critical approach with her curatorial research at Terme Art. She graduated from New York University in 2018 and did a lot of projects and will do a lot of projects with us. I'm very happy that you are here, and I would like to say some words about the content of this panel, and then we will introduce the panelists.
Hello, thank you so much for having me, and hello to everyone in the audience and to the people that I'm very happy to be sitting with right now on the stage. So I think in the normative and dominant visual habits. In her capacity as a researcher and lecturer, she's also engaged in a critical examination of the visual economy of the Eurocentric. Hilal is furthermore one of the founders of the international research collective AVAH, or the Afghan Visual Arts and History. Thank you so much for joining us from Hamburg. We're really happy to have you here today.
I'm from Hamburg. That's amazing. And Nicolas, you are actually sitting next to the tree. So we will see the interactions between the tree and Nicolas Gracia all the time, because the tree, with the wind blowing through it, will always reach out to your head and to your left ear. It's a very interesting experience we did in the past talks. So I will do it very short, because the next person doesn't need any introduction. This is the legendary Simon de Pury. Many knows him as the most prominent figure of the art market, but I know him as one of the people with maybe the deepest intuition if it comes to art and culture, and as an extremely critical mind. Somebody that was supporting a critical culture and artists from the very, very beginning, and that has a deep insight into art history and how art history connects with culture and how culture connects with our daily behavior and things that need criticism. And I'm looking very much forward, Simone, to hear your takes during this conversation, how your experience through art history and through working very close with artists, knowing artists, gave you a critical perspective. That's something that, and I'm very thankful that you take again the time to be with us, also as a member of our advisory board and our supporter from the very, very beginning. Thank you so much. And then another young advisory member of our board, one of the latest to be added to it. This is Artu Manumani. Artu Manumani, we met because of Burning Man, where Artu Manumani was responsible for a structure that he built. It was in 2018, the Temple Galaxy. That as people that don't know Burning Man consists out of hundreds of artworks, and one of the central pieces always is the temple. The temple is something extremely important, and the whole event is an anti-event to. It's like an anti-cultural event to the mainstream culture, with rules that every single rule can be read as a critic of mainstream culture. But if you follow these rules, it has also an extremely constructive element to it. So it's not only critics, but also construction to it. And I can wait, Arthur, to hear your take on this. Arthur is also a cutting-edge architect that is working with decentral information supply for architecture, 3D printing, and ecology. And this is also something that can be read as a criticism to the mainstream culture. And now I give the word back to Munilola. But first, a big applause for the panelists that they are all here. Thank you so much for everybody.
So I thought that maybe I could start with Edna, if that's okay. But so you obviously have an immense history in science and technology, and I think when it comes to science, it's often seen as something that kind of exists in this vacuum that doesn't have any like cultural effects or implications. And I kind of just wanted to get insight into like why is it important actually to also look at science through the lens of culture, patterns, racism, sexism, like, and I think also like to go a bit further, like in terms of how you've seen COVID also kind of revealing some of these patterns.
So that's a very big question and good question. And I would like to start by saying that I'm a recovering biologist, in that I was trained as a molecular biologist early on in my kind of academic studies, and decided to diverge from that for various reasons. I found that the methodological observational approach of the natural sciences was quite limiting insofar as who could be included into the realm of science. As someone who was always in the minority of laboratory technicians or other kinds of inquisitive questions about the world, and at the basis of my practice, I'm curious, and I want to know how we move through space, how light travels, etc. But science as a kind of hegemony, a paradigm, didn't often allow the space for a kind of multifarious, multinational, multi-ethnic group of people. So in thinking about science as this kind of category that I don't think should be fixed, but actually can be found in a kitchen, in the ways in which people construct and cook together, or even in how people observe the stars and the motion and construct their own constellation and epistemologies of the world, that we all breathe and move through the world as scientific creatures. If we turn it then till today in thinking about the pandemic that we're living through and what it evokes as a kind of subject, both human and it very much is bringing out and underlying inequalities that exist in our society. So for people like myself, as a Black American, diasporic, and also of Haitian descent, I know multiple people who have tested positive for COVID, and that's the reality of many Black Americans because of our exposure as frontline workers, etc. Nevertheless, it also has allowed people to have a call to action, to protest on the streets, as we've seen with the protests challenging the murder of Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, George Floyd, etc. And it's also calling to action very needed policies about universal health care within the US. So people are calling for Medicare for all and trying to advocate for another kind of world beyond what the nightmare people have been living through. So I would say that as a practitioner of science, as also a historian, as a writer, and as someone who has, through exhibition work, thinking about health and healing, the thing that I appreciated from this moment is how people are turning to speculative fiction. So there have been heaps of reading groups on Octavia Butler's work, Paolo Visoya. There have been Black feminists thinking about pleasure and joy as a way to challenge and combat the COVID crisis. So Adrienne Marine Brown's Pleasure Activism.
Amazing book.
Yeah, it's a wonderful book that really tries to think about how we can excavate pleasure, not just on a superficial level, but through eros, through orgasms, through collective circles of healing. And so in many ways, I would say that the answer to challenging the atrocities of this moment is looking to the most oppressed, is finding that joy, is collectivizing our struggle so that it doesn't become part of an effort to just rely on leadership, especially those that have, who I would consider to be moral monsters, particularly in the US context. So all of this is just to say is that I've been thinking actively about the different localities of science and how I and others like me fit into it, the power and beauty of speculation and imagination, and the importance of collective struggle and thinking to deal with the tragedies of today.
I think that it's interesting that you brought up speculative fiction, because I feel like speculative fiction is often this, you call it fiction, so it was made up, but it's often revealing like very real, like tangible aspects of like how we relate to each other. And I think that it's also, to me, like a really interesting tool to think about, like, what do we actually want, like, and how can we get it? And for you, Julieta, who's an artist that primarily not primarily, but there's an intense focus on speculative fiction, science fiction. Why do you return to those genres to inspire your work and your political action?
It's, I mean, like, it seems like one of the best places to try to imagine otherwise somehow, because I mean, like, one of the most difficult things is actually to try to imagine something that isn't here. We can always think of like subtle variations of what we know, but to think the unknown is really, really like much harder than you think. I mean, like, try to imagine a different economic system or a different kind of family, and then you keep hitting a brick. So speculative fiction has allowed me to be able to at least plug a bit into that mode of thinking, which I consider important for my work. I mean, like especially now, like listening to Edna, yeah, like one of the things that that has been very striking to me when looking at what has happened in the past 7 months is to see COVID operating across the fault lines that we already know. So it's not doing anything different, yeah, but it's just like really marking the inequalities and creating, I mean, like really pointing out what's visible and what is invisible, and which bodies are visible, which bodies are invisible. I was really touched when I saw at like early on in the pandemic, there were many images circulating from Italy, from Bergamo, of these like military trucks carrying bodies because the morgues were already full. And at the same time, there was a gruesome moment in Guayaquil in Ecuador where people were simply just leaving bodies out in the street, wrapped in plastic because they didn't know what to do. Same news cycle. Nobody saw those bodies, or nobody wanted to see them. because I mean they were in the newspapers, but they did not make conversation. So this idea of what's visible to us, what's invisible to us, what's my task as an artist to make visible, and when I'm thinking about representation, what it is that I choose to represent and how is, I mean, like it's something that, you know, it's if there is no prescriptive, like nothing prescriptive as to how can I create that, then there are modes of fiction that allow me to make narratives.
Is there one fiction in particular that has kind of like stuck with you that stands out
I mean,
for
like
you?
right now, right now it's writing itself. You know, it's. I mean, like I'm thinking a lot about. There is this idea of like what's an epistemic object, because I think that COVID is that thing. There is a historian of science, you may know who he is, Hans-Jörg Reinberger, who has been dealing with like the idea of an epistemic object, which is this thing that you know is there and it has a use, but you don't yet know what it is good for. So you keep throwing it against the wall to see what sticks. I mean, like this is what happened. Like, what has happened with, I don't know, penicillin? Yeah, like that was like a perfect epistemic object at some point. And I think COVID is that, and it. I mean, I'm working with it in that sense as a potential fiction and as an epistemic object and as something that can be. I mean, we can just let it operate across the lines of inequality, or we can make it work against the lines of inequality if we just put our minds to it.
Yeah, I definitely think that it's good that you emphasize that. Oftentimes, like people are saying, now the system has been broken, it's being revealed, and the system has always been broken. And I think that it's really important to like be really aware of like when you're saying that, like who are you talking about, or who are you leaving out of that conversation? I would like to bring it over to Nicholas, who is an amazing performance artist, painter, printmaker, and you have this emphasis on the monstrous or the stigmatized body or the fetishized body, and I'm just curious to know like what do these bodies hold for you in your practice, and how do they inspire you?
Well, I think like the monstrous is just really something that is really of interest to me, because really often the monstrous is very telling about the system or the society that creates that figure. And I think that especially in terms of like Black history, the monstrous, or like the the non-human, is something that is very, very telling of, yet again, like the society that creates, or like gives those names. And even in nowadays, politics, you observe a country like Poland, for example, where they all of a sudden, say that LGBT individuals are not humans, but like more an ideology, basically stripping them off of their human rights. I think that's something, as so often history keeps repeating itself, and then you really see how that society kind of creates a legitimation for othering processes and like treating people really badly. And that's why the monstrous, I think, is something that's really interesting to me. And at the same time, I think it's pretty much the yin-yang thing, because we have like every element in our characters. And even when you go back to like Gothic fiction, you see that a lot of those monstrous or like uncanny elements are like all the time haunting, especially bourgeois aristocratic circles. And I think that's something interesting to look at.
I think that objection or the uncanny is often it's a rejection of what already exists within you that you recognize, but that you maybe don't understand.
Exactly.
So then the easiest thing to do is to mark it as bad or as
demonize.
Exactly. But I think what's most interesting is that if you really kind of look and like peel back the layer of what is being demonized, you see that this like measure of legitimacy is false, or it's also been it's also a construct. It's also been just created for like a really specific means. You're gonna.
Oh yeah, yeah. It's very interesting how this all relates to Burning Man, actually, because
it?
actually the science fiction that you're working with and everything what you said, I love the concept of this epistemic object, but also Stanisław Lem that connects us very much was basically thinking the unthinkable. That was totally impossible. That was totally anti-science in the first moment, but then it turns out to be science and turned out to be the exactly right path forward and to be like a kind of prophecy. And it's interesting how Lem, I had this discussion today morning, turned from a writer of science fiction into an author of science in his later years. And Arthur Manumani is nagging his head because he's actually exactly understanding what we are saying here. And as one of the key figures of the of this mega project Burning Man, that is a critical culture against mainstream constructing a new world, because it's the problem of criticism always is that it can end with criticism. Yeah, I had today morning this conversation with Tino Sagal that actually said, and I'm super proud of this, that he loves our newsletters because they are critical, but in a constructive way, trying to show an utopian picture. Because it's very difficult actually to draw something that is really, utopian and working somehow, based on this criticism. And Burning Man is trying to do this with a very strange outcome. And maybe Arthur, you can give a take on this. How was your experience? How are these rules? How is the critics of it? And how is the construction of reality at Burning Man?
Yeah, of course. Can you guys hear me well?
Yeah.
Fantastic. No, I really enjoy this idea of speculative fiction to kind of come up with new solutions. And Burning Man is here to give a speculative reality in a way. It's got rules like gift economy, radical self-expression, radical self-reliance, leave no trace. So they're experimenting on frameworks, but physically. And you have no choice. You can't escape because you're physically present, and everyone is meant to be the artist in a sense. And so you don't really have a spectator and an artist. You are forced to perform. So the idea of criticality is through engagement, through involvement. And so in that sense, it's often different than art as we would know it as a kind of object and spectator. You're engaging with it in a way that you are also considered the artist. And so you create new worlds, new rules, but also you teach and you engage people. So when we did Galaxia, the Burning Man Temple, everyone was a volunteer. And everyone would go on the table. I think you have some pictures that are running through the screen, but they would go up the table and say why they're here, what brought them here, why do they want to create a new spirituality, a new, a building that is supposed to represent I would say, I don't want to use the word religion because it's not quite that, because it's meant to be radically inclusive. Radical inclusion is one of the principles of Burning Man. But it's a spirituality in which everyone can suffer together. Wherever you come from, whatever your background, I come from multiple heritage, but really it didn't matter in this sense because we were all sharing what made us suffer, what gave us joy. I don't know if maybe that's what you meant by pleasure activism, or the activism through the emotions that we can all feel. And so that really is what happened and united us throughout this construction. There is the book Homo Sapiens, in which they explain that civilization started at the point that we were building temples together. By the moment that we were constructing objects and we had a common goal, a common objective. And so Burning Man allows us to do that on a way that is temporary and that disappears. And so every year we reinvent that. We reinvent the city, we reinvent. And so we get a speculative reality that happens on an architectural and an urban scale, which I find very interesting in relation to what you were saying about speculative reality.
Yeah, thank you very much, Simon. Nicolas Gracia, we had him booked basically for this panel, and then Hans Ulrich, that could do only Friday, said, no, I need to have him also on our panel. And then Nicolas had to basically be on both panels, because his paintings are really, this monstrous element is, so much reminding me actually in another artist that you know very well, Francis Bacon, that was creating, this incredible. Back then it was maybe you know Bayerle and you know this. Can you imagine? Can you imagine our world without this avant-garde that was basically questioning everything what they found and trying to do everything different, going out of the Eurocentristic perspective with taking the Eurocentristic perspective outside, obviously, because they couldn't get rid of it, but at least trying to completely question our cultural heritage and create a new one. Could you hear me, Simon? But
managed to unmute. I didn't fully realize this question was asked to me. So
oh, sorry. So
about all the monsters and their presence in the history of art throughout the times, and you know, the apocalyptic visions of Hieronymus Bosch, where monsters played a key part, and you know, in when you look at the way Picasso was transforming the face of Dora Maar during the wartime, years of war, and they don't look like monsters, but they certainly are completely refigured and completely changed, and so Bacon even more so. And you know, there are endless examples in the history of art of artists, you know, grappling with monstrous figures. Also, I love in Japan when you have the gods in front of the temples that all look very monstrous, but at the same time are there to protect you. So yes, we are at a time where we do need monsters also to protect us. When we have when we have real monsters who don't look like monsters. So the people who do look like monsters are in fact the least monstrous people. Anyhow, now tell me exactly what you wanted me to speak about.
So I will tell you exactly what to say. Wait a second. No, but what I found extremely interesting, that without the avant-garde, without the outsider art, that was actually a part of or was actually the forefront of the avant-garde, we wouldn't have had the IT revolution that led then later to forms of expression like Burning Man. It's somehow very much connected that we were freed through people like Jules Verne as a writer, or through people like Stanisław Lem as a science fiction writer, in thinking in a direction that was absolutely critical and absolutely diametrically against the mainstream culture back then, and it was considered to be just crazy, yeah, like the outsider art, like the, you know, non-academic art of Rousseau, for example, or and then it materializes from going from this, you know, high cultural, very elitist also approach, because this is an elitist perspective to be against mainstream in a certain way, because we have the intellectual ability, but then it goes back into the mainstream culture because there's even a healing element to it, and this kind of I don't know, I can, you know, put it also into the round without, maybe so that we go more in the dialogue.
Yeah, I would. Yeah,
yes, exactly.
Yeah. Hi.
Hi.
Yeah, I think when we're thinking about mainstream, I think also like mainstream can be just like pop music or like blockbuster movies, but it can also be like Eurocentric, heteronormative, ableist worlds and perspectives that are dominating the narrative. So I think that it's important when we're talking about mainstream, like what mainstream are you talking about? Because they have very different implications. But I think this brings me kind of really easily into Moshtari's practice, which to me kind of shows the liberatory aspects of research and being able to go into one's own family and cultural heritage to find beauty and to find a new way of seeing yourself. And I just kind of wanted to know more about how you kind of came into your practice and how it has allowed you to think about beauty differently, and how it has allowed you to kind of deconstruct this idea of Eurocentric beauty, which is always being projected onto bodies that don't fit into that criteria.
Yeah, thank you for this question. Also, I really like what has been said before, especially the element of the monstrous. I'm actually right now researching and doing some work about the ugliness or the ugly as an archive or as a space, as a place where we should dig deeper, especially if you yourself feel ugly or you're ashamed or you feel like a monster. Go into that, like instead of trying to get away from that and assimilating into something that could be mainstream culture or hegemony. Go into that shame, go into that feeling of ugliness, or sometimes like you even feel barbaric or evil. You know, you have like these labels, these this gaze from the outside that is making you identify with these tropes. And for me personally, it started with beauty and ugliness. I growing up as a minority kid, I had to struggle with the gaze and also the depiction that was always creating identity for me or heritage for me that I didn't really see myself didn't really identify with. And at the same time, consuming mainstream culture, and you already said it, you know, pop music, but also news and everything that was either creating a terrorist image of where I come from or not depicting me at all, led me to the space where I started my creative process, deciding whether I wanted to assimilate or create an alternative. And I think you quoted it in the beginning, the radical subjectivity part. I think radical subjectivity for me as an approach, as a creative approach, but also approach like a philosophical approach in my personal path and biography, is an approach where you respect and acknowledge your experience and your perspective as valid, and sometimes also as a place where you can productively and efficiently criticize the status quo, the hegemony. I think wherever we have objectivity, and we talked about it in the sense of science, but also the same in the art field, right? Because maybe the avant-garde was avant-garde at that time, but now it's everywhere in the museums. So at some point, even critical voices in the avant-garde becomes part of the hegemony, and we have to reproduce critical culture every generation, in every context. We have to reinvent it in a way, and radical subjectivity can be that resource where you can just focus on yourself and find there the content that has been not talked about, that has been not represented in the mainstream culture or hegemony.
I think also like when I hear this idea of radical subjectivity and going inward and kind of staring in the mirror and trying to understand like what you see always brings me back to this idea that it's not just my fight to fight alone. I think that especially if you're growing up in an environment where people don't look like you or don't talk like you or don't act like you kind of feel like you're the only person that's like bearing this cross and that no one understands. But then as you grow and mature, you realize that the way that you felt is not because of who you are, but about how the system is. And I mean, I don't know, I feel like maybe most of the people on this panel, or everyone on this panel in some way can kind of relate to this idea of seeing that there was a space that was not for you and deciding that instead of trying to burst through the door and break it down and just be in that space, like I can just kind of begin to think about how to build the tools and to make my own space, or to make a space that is for healing and for everyone, and that is inclusive. But yeah, I don't know, I think I want to hear more maybe from Nicholas about just in the past 7 months of the COVID and all of the protests, how have your priorities like shifted as an artist, or do you feel like they've actually stayed the same? How has your practice like changed or shifted, or yeah, just What happened? What went down? Yeah.
I wouldn't say that anything really has shifted, but I think that certain things kind of like stood out more than the others, and like I really realized that I really got to stay in dialogue with people, because what I noticed was that there was a lot of cancel culture happening, especially when it came to like ideas about like anti-racist behavior, decolonial practices, and like a lot of white friends especially were really into the topic, but I was interestingly encountering a lot of resistance and like yeah, well, questioning from like POC friends, which was really interesting to me actually, because they were like so frustrated maybe, or like not even, kind of like tired of it all, of the whole discussion. And then again, like I would always answer saying that, they would literally say stuff like, why do you even try to explain racism to white people? And I'm like, how could I sign that statement if I grew up with a white, stepfather? And like, if I would have, who was like, obviously from a different generation and like pretty often saying racist stuff unknowingly, you know what I mean? And I would always say, how could I stop trying to fight against that, like stay in a dialogue, because otherwise my life would have been really, really tiresome, I guess. And I think, that kind of really showed that there is still a lot of work to do in that respect. And what I also really thought was interesting was that in conversation with a lot of different people, the whole concept of the feedback loop really came into play, and that what I really often observe when it comes to like black people standing up for their rights, or anyone really standing up for their rights, is that you're then being labeled as obnoxious because you're being loud about it. And I think that's another problem that still needs to be tackled in many, many ways. And that is what kind of makes it really difficult for like people to find that safe space without being, because you have to be like in contact and like in exchange with people. And I was observing like reading about interesting things, like there's this platform Grinder, for example, where it's a gay community platform, and they were thinking about introducing a filter where you could like filter black bodies, Asian people. And then some people were like saying that they think that it's really great, because then in order to avoid like, being canceled out and stuff like that.
What they can bring to a conversation or to a movement is always shifting and changing. And I think maybe this can maybe bring me to Julieta. And we were speaking earlier when we were having our little lunch before the panel, that, yeah, like you kind of went through this period where you were so on, like, just running around, like, trying to do all these projects, and obviously, like, your activism is also, like, very deeply wedged into that. But then you kind of realized that you had nothing left, basically, at the end of this. And I just kind of want to hear more about, like, how have you been protecting your own, like, yourself and sustaining yourself in this, in the past 7 months, and yeah, just you can.
I mean, like, well, one of the things I guess, like what we were talking about was like processes of self-exploitation, and what you end up doing as an artist. Let's say the moment you start having a career, you start giving in to saying a lot of yes. Like I'm going to have that show, I'm going to do this, I'm going to write that text, I'm going to be at that talk, yes, 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 and it's a lot of self-exploitation, which I end up calling self-extractivism, because it's not just that you exploit yourself as labor, you also poke holes into what you have, and at the end you are like, whoa, I'm like just full of holes, I have like nothing left, and how do I refill myself with something? Because the moment that I'm empty, the machine that is there is going to call for the next thing that is still full, and you get discarded. So how do you remain, I mean, like this actually, like it makes me think also about what was being mentioned in terms of mainstream and processes of assimilation. That's something that happens, like I'm like a third, fourth culture, who knows what, not so white person, coming from Mexico by way of like 3 countries. Then you come to Germany, which is a country that I love, has been very generous to me, and demands, is very homogeneous, and demands something which is very peculiar, which is that you assimilate. You have to become mainstream. basically. And I'm using Germany as an example because we are here, but also because that's the way the mainstream operates. It makes a demand that you have to become it. And in order to become it, the only problem is that if you are already something, you have to forgo that thing that you already are. So every time, it's very funny, every time I have to do every 2 years this horrible thing at the Ausländer Behörde, which is a place I hope you never have to go to, is hell. And every time I go, I am told I am not German enough. And I was like, but I am Mexican. I can't be German. I'm already something else. So why can't I be this thing that I am? Why there is this demand that I let go? That I, and this is something that I always think of it in terms of what passing means, yeah? And what does it mean? I mean, like, could I pass for German? Not with this hair, not with this accent. I mean, like, so, and would I want to pass for something else that I am not? And that means becoming ersatz mainstream somehow. But then again, if you can pass, what does it mean to pass? I mean, like, if you pass through a door, does that mean that you get to keep that door open? And I mean, like, it's so, like, like, to me, that's all, it all keeps, it's part of this thing of, okay, so why do I exploit myself? Why do I extract to myself? Why do I put myself in these situations where I don't really fit? But I kind of fit, but not really, and what is the intrinsic job at the bottom of being in this uncomfortable position? And I mean, it's not really like an answer, but it's like what I'm thinking about these days.
Yeah.
But actually, there's one thing just here, because from the perspective of Umberto Maturana, that was yesterday on our talk present.
Jean-Michel Basquiat is, started as a street artist and has become more and more popular in market terms. And in middle of the Corona crisis and the middle of all the upheavals in the United States and elsewhere, one painting by Jean-Michel Basquiat was rumored to have changed hands in a private transaction for $135 million, which was quite a bit above his previous world record. And so he became, when you measure in terms of prices, which is of course only one metric to measure the market, he has entered kind of a new stratosphere. And Jean-Michel Basquiat is, in a way, the Vincent van Gogh of the 20th century, in the sense that it's a myth. He has produced the same amount of works that Van Gogh has produced, and there is, besides the incredible artistic quality, there is the fact that he did pass away very young, and so there is a whole mythification happening. But what is interesting, I think, in general, in terms of the art market, it is only over the last 5 to 8 years that African American or African artists or artists from different ethnicities really reached a strong market interest and became attained high prices on the open art market. Also, in terms of gender, I remember conducting a charity auction. It was for MTV Redefine in Dallas, and there were 58 works or something like that in an exhibition. And I was told to choose 8 works that I would have to auction off during a gala. And so I went around the exhibition and chose 8 works that I thought would obtain the highest prices for this charity, with AIDS research. So I chose 8 works. I did not take any notice of what the gender were, and it just so happens that amongst the 8 works, 6 were by men and 2 by ladies. And so after the auction, one lady came up to me and said, how on earth did you choose only 2 female artists? I mean, how dare you? And then I explained that I had looked just how I could raise the maximum amount for the charity, that I actually hadn't even thought of the gender of the artist. I was purely looking at it in financial terms. And then she said, you're a male chauvinist pig to think this way. And there again, I think that the market very recently is trying to address this. And the market for female artists has greatly caught up with the market of male artists. But these things are only happening in a very, very recent past. And so you see, or it took years and years and years before Basquiat was in any public collection. So you see that there are so many preconceived ideas that we take for granted. The art market was always a very inclusive and open place. I remember starting in the art market in the 1970s, and I was in a junior position at Sotheby's, and it did not matter what background you were, what religion, what sexual orientation, what age you were. If you were talented, you could progress and get access to great positions.
I disagree. I mean,
and
but
so, yes.
Sorry, I don't mean to cut you off. I'm just because you said earlier that the market for male artists and white artists was much higher than for women, for people of color, for other minorities. And then in the next sentence, you say that it didn't matter like where you came from, like you would be accepted. And I just feel
yes,
like
I'm speaking of the difference of people working in the marketplace, whether people working in the auction houses, in galleries, in auction companies, as opposed to the artists who were obtaining the highest prices or the highest acclaim in the marketplace. That's the difference between the two. Whereas in the financial sector, I was put on the board of a asset management company, and then I was very surprised to see that there was not a single woman on that board. And for me, it was very surprising coming from the art market where there was inclusion all along amongst professionals, but not the marketplace itself. The market itself was not recognizing it, and it's only very recently that this has now begun to correct itself.
I think what I find super interesting is that we, in our system, we measure everything with money. Yeah. So the question, what is the auction result of a certain artist, can be already an indicator of a kind of establishment of critique within the system, yeah? And this is something that is a paradox, yeah. Because if critique becomes the system, it becomes mainstream, yeah. So it's interesting because, like Basquiat, for example, almost any painting you are standing in front of, you can feel the power, but you can also feel that it was created in very precarious situations, yeah. So it was created actually in a very very far away from the mainstream, yeah. But now it's actually become a part of it. And the question is this a good development of critique, that it becomes a part of the criticized system?
Well, as you say rightly, it's only one metrics, or one to measure. Whether an artist is very expensive, it doesn't mean that he is a great artist or that the quality is outstanding. All that is just one metrics. It just means that the people who spend money and can afford to spend a lot of money, a single artwork, are putting value, financial value in an artwork. Human nature, sadly, is a little bit that unless there is a financial value that is attached to an artwork, people tend to take it less seriously, or they think it's less worthwhile protecting. And I made this experience as a very young man when I was working at the front counter at Sotheby's, and there was a elderly couple who came with a big parcel. It took them nearly 1 hour to unpack it because they said this was a great family heirloom. And finally, they unpacked it with great care. And then when a specialist from Sotheby's tried to tell them as diplomatically as possible that this work did not have any commercial value, not any financial value, they threw it back in the box and took zero care from that moment onwards, and were no longer thinking it was worthwhile protecting that artwork that until that moment they had worshipped in their family. So there is something, I always say it's important for artworks to have a financial value just so they get protected. You know, it's like when you are a real estate thing and a construction site, you suddenly fall on a trove of antiquities. Unless those had a financial value, bulldozers would just destroy them all. It's purely because they have a financial value that people think it's maybe worthwhile to protect them.
Well, I have another question. Like you were saying that you've seen like you know, a change in the way people appreciate like different perspectives, and like, you know, that the art market especially has kind of like liberated itself of its archaic forms. What do you think is the reason for that? Like what was, you know, what was the beginning? What was the moment that marked that shift?
I think it is a general switch in the zeitgeist, in the general you know, topic. I think also the Me Too movement has played a big role in all of that, and which then brings to another issue is you have some people who have been, you know, branded as a result of the Me Too movement, and who have been instantly, you know, taken off whatever positions of responsibilities they had. And then, you know, when an artist is affected like that, what is your attitude towards it? Can you still admire or like their work? Or is this no longer something that is accepted? And then the question is, you could empty a lot of museums and works by some great artists if their personal attitude as humans, as opposed to their qualities as artists, were despicable. And so, again, the question is, the market is only a reflection then of how much somebody is prepared to put their own money into something. It's to you know, show what you believe in, and because if you spend a lot of your own money, it means that you attach value to this particular thing. So I think it's fascinating to see all these questions that are linked to that.
But what's also really interesting to me is that I just find it so hard to believe that back then it didn't really matter in the art market whether, you know, what kind of background you had, because I think that a lot of it has to do with you know, access to like education as well. And I'm wondering like who even had the opportunity to be in that market, like work in those places back then. So probably those that were left in any case came of, you know, had like affluent background. So really difficult for me to believe that it never mattered.
I don't believe it.
I mean, like, that's still true. I mean, like most, you know, like there is this like unspoken class rule.
Exactly.
Which is that it's like being an artist or a curator is a dilettante position where you are not even expected to make money because you come from money.
Yeah.
Now, I mean, like I'm just like curious as to what we were talking about. I want to speak, for example, about Carl André. Yeah, like him being a prime example of one of those so-called great artists that, you know, arguably killed another great artist. So, I mean, like something that was, it has been in my mind recently because of recent murder of Saul Fletcher, killed Rebecca Bloom, and so it made the news recently, and it reminded me of the story between Carl André and Anna Mendieta, and specifically about Carl André's retrospective in LACMA, I believe, where the curator of the retrospective, and his name, I should have it here, but it's out of my mind for a second. He said, like when he was quoted, what he said is, well, things happen, Carl broke something, but he's a great artist. And this is not a court of law. Now, the word that stick to my mind there is Carl broke something. Yeah, that is the way in which the killing of a female artist is referred to is kind of like, I mean, like I'm ready to not have any more Carl Andre, like totally happy, like, you know, like that room can be taken by somebody else.
I think this is something this is exactly what is new. Yeah, that we see a much bigger context of art. We are not only seeing the object, we are seeing the social sculpture around it. I find it super interesting because now Arthur is representing a generation of artists that are basically building their art for 1 week, investing like an incredible amount of personal energy and time just to burn it at the end. Yeah, to leave no traces. So the whole capitalistic element that was just represented by Simon here is completely pulled out of the system. At Burning Man, you're not even allowed to buy or sell something. You can only gift something. Yeah? So the monetary value, I think that is maybe one of the crucial problems of access to something. This is exactly what you just said. You are expected to have the money. You are expected to have the resources to get the access, and this is pulled out, and I found it this actually an extremely productive critical perspective, because this is something I don't believe that we can realize this in society in total, you know, not have any money, but we can create the spaces that are free from this unnecessary, you know, money value. This is actually the burning project, the burning temple Galaxia, that he built it with 100 volunteers, and then it was gone. Yeah.
I have a question about that, especially in light of California right now undergoing forest fires and being subjected to an environmental catastrophe. And Australia also had a series of fires, and we see other kinds of environmental destruction happening on an international scale. To what extent, given that the climate crisis is the biggest crisis that we have in our lifetime, to what extent are artists, especially as they think about creating works, thinking about working with materials that are sustainable, that are not causing a carbon kind of emission and contributing to that consumption culture? And I wonder what work it would mean, not just to think about access of who's part of our community with respect to race, gender orientation, etc., but also how we work with the resources and materials to not cause further damage on this already, you know, destroyed planet.
This is a question that I feel like maybe we could direct to Arthur, actually, because I'm sure that, you know, yeah, as an architect, in the face of COVID, and just things have changed, and so I'm kind of curious to know how your practice has kind of responded to these environmental and political questions.
No, but also the criticism. I mean.
Any criticism?
It's a great question. The environmental aspect of all that is, of course, something of concern. The value of building it with people and placing offerings in there. Our team was extremely diverse, and we had people from you know, all heritage, all backgrounds, and they were all able to express themselves through that structure. So what I mean by that, the structure was made with as little wood as possible. In fact, we tried to offset it, and we were told that it was only 4 tons of carbons that were up. Really, the problem was in people taking the plane, not the structure itself. The burning of it was really an act of ritual. It was a ritual of letting go of everything that pained us, everything that people wanted to express. You know, I had like pretty traumatic depression, and I needed a place where I could express that it was okay not to be okay. And we all burnt it in silence, 70,000 people going around the structure and crying whilst this was burning. Now it's really cathartic to experience that, to build something, to realize that by building something together, we can express our pain together rather than pointing fingers. And I think this was something that was really incredible. Now, I don't want to burn structures, and obviously I want to invent new rituals. And Nikolai reached out after this, and we were talking about doing a new project that wasn't going to be burnt, but that was going to be disassembled and then reassembled in different cities. It was amazing idea. I really enjoyed that, because we would create a ritual of disassembly. The idea that society can reinvent itself is something very empowering. And the structure was an amphitheater made of amphitheater. It was a fractal. So there wasn't a center per se. It was everyone was going to look at themselves and think, what can they do? What is their action able to do to change the status quo? And this criticality is the criticality of mirror, right? It's the idea that we're going to look at ourselves and do something, all of us, in order to better the planet and heal the issues. And so that was brilliant, although COVID happened, so we had to cancel Burning Man. And what happened was, I think, was a really interesting twist, is that we ended up doing it in the virtual reality world. And so what happened is as more people came to see that structure, which now lies into what we call a metaverse, which is an alternate physical internet. So if you have a PC, it's all free. You can all go and see it, albeit either on a screen or on virtual goggles. But for example, Nikolai and I met there and we talked and we were like, it's so funny how we feel we're in a digital world. Right now I'm in Zoom and in front of the screen. It's a bit uncanny to see myself on the screen with you guys. I really wish I was here, but I'm blocked by quarantine. But at the same time, when you think of carbon footprint and the idea that really what happened at Burning Man, why is it environmentally questionable, is really transportation and everyone going from around the world there, because the impact, the metrics of planes is so much worse than whatever we end up building, whatever the artistic value of what we create. And so when we all met up 2 weeks ago online with avatars together to recreate this, and it was truly radically inclusive because anyone could come, anyone, there wasn't any tickets, any commercial element to it. And we were just there creating new worlds. Anyone could create a world if you had, of course, digital knowledge, which is something I teach. And I think teaching is ultimately the best way to transmit and to have empowerment of people. And so we just ended up doing it all virtually. And now I do a lot of these kind of virtual reality projects because that's what architects can do. We can't really build things now. And so that's been an interesting transition in our practice.
No, but Edna, I have to say that Edna is actually right, and we have to live with a piece of this criticism. We cannot take it, we cannot basically deny it, that anything what we are doing, we have to ask the question, is it actually justified? Because anything what we are doing is adding to the pollution, is adding to the CO2 emissions, yeah? And also flying, and this is actually for all artistic practice, but also for all industrial practice, for all practice, always a question that we have to ask, and we will always end up in a tragic situation, yeah, that we never can do anything without harming something. This is what
I mean, this is something I've been thinking a lot about as an artist in terms of well, two things. Yeah, one is what we claim to do as a field, which is to imagine a future and to propose better futures even. So last year I organized the Conversations program for Art Basel, and I did a couple of talks on ecology, where I was specifically focused on the ecological footprint of the art fair itself. And the materials, what does it mean to be shipping 300 kilograms of concrete back and forth? And really concrete, giant balls of cement and the sheer amount of packing and crates and walls that get put up and taken down, and because of customs, how many works just simply get destroyed afterwards. And I mean, when you think about not just Basel, but Basel and Venice and Frieze and every single biennial, our footprint is really ugly. For what we claim to care about, it's really, really ugly. So at a personal level, I have taken a lot of interest in my own materials and also where I produce and what I produce. That's what I can do modestly at a personal level, but I think it's important to think about that, because we cannot ask, there is a really impossible demand, which is to say, I want change without me changing.
Yeah.
And that is just, that it's not possible. So you want change, then change.
Mushtari, hi. You've been a bit quiet. I guess maybe this idea of thinking about your materials is actually something that I'm gonna also apply to my own practice. So thank you for that. That's actually really helpful. And for Mushtari, I just kind of wanted to maybe ask, like, what does responsibility mean to you? And I know that you do have a platform to share your art, and with that comes a really large responsibility. And I think this idea that you can like make art, but that if you're not actually also embodying the things that you create in this other type of way, then what's the point? So I just kind of want to hear more about, I guess, how you kind of weigh with these ideas in your practice and in how you relate to your community. Yeah, I hope that made sense.
Yeah, I was just listening to the conversation happening, and actually I would like to add also that I find it really interesting when we talk about the footprint or financial value and the market, because of course we have this very limited perspective on these artworks and artists and archives and markets. As being also part of a collective, Avron Visual Arts and History, and we research artists in the diaspora, in the Afghan diaspora, but also living in Afghanistan, and how limited their access is to the market, but also how limited their mobility is. Speaking of, for example, just getting a visa to attend a festival or something, just by being through the geography or the politics of the region, completely isolated from the rest of the world. And I think this is also a discussion happening from a place of privilege, right? When we talk about materiality or who is an artwork being sold in the market, a certain kind of artwork or a certain kind of artistic practice consumable by the market, and for that reason maybe like less avant-garde or less critical because it's, I don't know, going to bad with capitalism, or is I don't know, having an object, an actual object, a classic painting or a drawing sold, is that conservative, should be moved towards more conceptual, theoretical approaches in the arts. I think this whole conversation is not thinking about lots of artists who are not even part of this footprint or of this past, of this past that we want to move on from. And for us, for example, as curators and researchers at the collective, for us it's important, for example, to build an archive, to have, to collect information, to have references, to have institutions, to have power. And while the conversations happening here are more like, let's share power, let's move on from it. So I think I just wanted to add that this is also part of my approach to this whole thing. Where are we speaking from, right? And yeah, I just wanted to add that. I know I didn't respond to your question. Can you repeat your question?
It's okay. No, I
No,
mean,
it's perfect. I mean, it's perfect.
Yeah.
So just so everybody can actually.
Yeah, this just makes me think about my best friend, Myra Rodriguez Castro, who is an Afro-Colombian poet and scholar who basically at the beginning of quarantine flew to Bogota to be with her mother and has been there ever since, and she wasn't able to travel at all. And the lockdown was extremely harsh. And, you know, but there were flights that were being able to leave Colombia, but these were flights for people that had American passports or European passports. And yeah, she just was like, in this time, I've just kind of had to like really stare at how little the world actually cares about Black people, but also more in particular Black people from the global South who don't have access to class or to even any type of proximity to whiteness, essentially. And for me as a Black American person, I have to be honest, like a lot of the conversations that are had about race do center in some ways like my own experience living in America, but there's also all of these other conversations that are not being had about these people that are coming from these less popular places in the eyes of the other. And so I do think that we all need to do better. I need to do better also in terms of who I'm breaking bread with, who I include into a conversation. And it's really it's a difficult process because you are again having to stare this kind of monster in the face that you also that's also a part of you too, and you have to kind of recognize it and not be afraid of it. And but you're totally right. And one other thing, Simone, you did say earlier that money does not make an excellent artist, and I totally agree with you. And unfortunately, like, we live in a world where there's still like an immense wealth imbalance, and so oftentimes, like, just the people that have money can decide where the energy and the labor is put towards. And I do think that as we continue to move forward and across and diagonally, whatever, that we kind of keep that in the back of our minds, that money does not create excellence, that money does not, money, all that money does is show who has it and who wants to spend it and on what, and that's power, and so I think that this is something that we need to be, also, like, again, like, for me, it's not exciting if a black artist is now getting a painting sold for $120 million. That doesn't, for me, represent like progress. Maybe like in one type of way it does, but I still think that you're still comparing something to a measure, and that's still violent, and that's still problematic, basically. So I think that we really need to get very like specific and very particular with what we're talking about when we talk about like liberation and equality, because I think the conversation. Yeah, go. Sorry.
I think you probably have to like invent a totally new language, because when I think about like Helen Gilbert, for example, who was writing a lot about like post-colonial theater, she was always criticizing that it's really difficult to like free yourself from your colonizer in a way while using the same kind of language. And I think the art world and the way it's commodified probably has to like change its system parameters whatsoever in whatever way. Because otherwise you're never going to free yourself from that. Because like every thought is drenched in like that very specific neoliberal idea, Yeah.
And then, sorry. We had a conversation with Zoe Whitley like a few weeks ago, and who's this amazing black curator living in London, and she basically was talking about how she dreams of this new model where instead of the money being hundreds of thousands of dollars of budget being given to these superstar sculptor artists for these big shows and this whatever, and then you have this massive budget for that type of artist, and then the artists that are like the community artists, the artists that are working with the people around them, get a budget of like $200 and some crackers. Like, it needs to be completely flipped, basically. Like, we need to recognize that the artists that are also like very like actively working within their own communities are also seeing that budget go towards those projects and being a part of I just thought it was interesting, this like flip, basically, of like what we're emphasizing. Yeah.
One thing too that I think is so valuable but hasn't been mentioned as what is necessary for not just art production but writing is time. And I say this mostly because since March, one of the things that I've been privileged to have in captivity / confinement is more jurisdiction over my own time. And that has meant that I've been able to rest when I want to rest, avoid people who often trigger me in public, walking down the street or perhaps at work or wherever else, and just having the time to read the text, novels. Like, I read an erotic novel, Raven Lalani's Lester, the other day. I finished up Audre Lorde's Cancer Journals. I've just been writing and manifesting in a way that I, for the first time in my lineage, I'm the first person to have time, even though I'm the 8th generation of my ancestors that's been free because of the Haitian Revolution. And yet, this is the first generation where I can decide to sit and do and create in the way that I want to do so. And it shouldn't be a privilege. It should be ubiquitous, and it should be something that everyone has access to, rest and care, which is part of what the exhibition work I had in February earlier in Berlin looks at, which was the cartographies of care in the African diaspora, from people who were born on the continent in the Caribbean and here in Europe. And one of the things that people kept saying at that time, and now I'm still absorbing, is that we just don't always have time as Black people, no matter where we live. And COVID gave me time.
I mean, like there is one thing which like still rings true, which is like a very simple saying: time is money, right?
Exactly.
So
Yes.
we
Exactly.
don't,
Was just thinking
we don't
about
always have it. I mean, my experience of the pandemic was exactly the opposite of yours because I have a child. And so I spent the last 7 months, I'm a single mom by choice, so I spent the last 7 months with a 4-year-old on my shoulder, which is like having a demented monkey screaming the whole time.
It's quite cute.
No, while at the same time I was having the demands of the world, okay? So my kitchen table was my desk, was where I was cooking, where I was expected to write, where I was expected to read, and because I could not hide, you know, I normally can throw a smoke screen and say I have to travel, I have a show, I'm off, but everybody knew I was in my apartment. So, can you have this text ready? Can you answer that email? And it's like, you know, I'm making breakfast, and then I do the dishes, and then I have to make lunch, and then I do the dishes, and then I have to make dinner. So no text. Like, no text, no email answer, no show, like nothing. So for the last 7 months, I have been, I encountered domestic time like hardcore for the first time in my life because I also had no access to childcare. And that was like a really, you know, illuminating experience as to the, you know, like what does it mean to, I mean, like this has been part of my work since I became a mother, which is to really try to understand social reproduction. But like this was like, okay, hardcore. Like I have no time. I'm not the master of my time.
Well, this is why I appreciate Sophie Lewis's book, like Full Surrogacy Now, which calls for collectivizing not just childcare, but how reproduction happens as a whole. Because at the end of the day, it shouldn't be your individual responsibility.
No. I mean, like having chosen to be a single mom by choice means that I have kin. I mean, like I have childcare and like a loose network, which COVID disrupted completely. So like none of my, you know, odd kin people could come. So it was like, oh wow, like this is like, I encountered the reality that a lot of people face.
But I think as we're going to the end, the title "Critical Culture," you know, if we could ask everybody to give this one sentence, what means critical culture, or what should it mean? It can be more than one sentence. In my opinion, is consciousness. Culture can bring something into consciousness that wasn't there, you know, that is completely covered, that is not a part of our, that cannot become a part of our decisions. Nicolas said it, that basically when you try to, when you have to explain something to somebody else that this person is not aware of, then this is already a cultural technique that you're using, and that is also happening when you do an installation or a painting. And I think this is something that we forget how powerful this can be, and it can be powerful. For me, it means a lot when this becomes rewarded suddenly and there's more resources accumulated into this, because nobody is deciding about resources. Nobody is deciding about who gets how much money. This is happening almost automatically. You know, there's many decisions, millions of decisions. This is what Adam Smith described with the invisible hand of the market, and it's still valid that these decisions are so many that if we want to change the decisions, we have to change the culture, because we cannot change every single person. We have to change a system, and this is where culture can be really extremely powerful, and I think much more powerful than politics and much more powerful than economics. And this is why here should be the power, but used in a very conscious way. That would be my take on it. Julieta?
This is a sentence I already said, is you cannot have change without changing yourself.
Okay. It's hard for me to have a one statement about such a grand topic. What? Well, mostly because even the term culture for me is problematic in terms of it not having a single unit, and it's something that, as someone who moves between multiple worlds and between the Caribbean, North America, now in Europe, and also the African continent, I just I don't have a one, solution and or aphorism. So I guess I'll pass on that.
It's exactly what Susan Boyce did.
Yeah, it's real difficult, but I probably would say that it would probably mean that you're, yeah, be the best gatekeeper you can be, and like understand that you might have to like give up on your privilege in order to like, you know, the larger, you know, narrative to succeed that you want to see succeeding and like change the world. And in a way, it's again what you already said, like you can't change anything if you don't change yourself, really.
Arthur?
Well, first, thank you so much for allowing me to not be here physically. I appreciate that. I think there is an idea that it would be really, it would be extremely constructive, I think, to use art as a way to communicate things that are made from one's creativity. Often in the discourse, indeed, it is often difficult to talk about this topic. That is 100%. It's hard for me, of course, being a man, being I guess white as appearance. It always been hard, and I guess you guys know that it is hard for and it's not my place to say anything. But through art, one can have a universal language, something that goes beyond who I am or what I am as a person. And architecture allows to enable other people to be part of this. As a teacher, as someone who likes to share through things like the open source movement, through things like gift economy, one can go beyond the values of what's economic. One can go beyond simple metrics. One can start talking about emotions and suffering and pain. And these are universal things. Universal things would go against the idea necessarily of division, which makes it a bit hard in this topic because, you know, diversity needs to come from division, you know, but how do we then unite whilst keeping the diversity? And I think art is really, and culture is really the answer for that.
Simon, critical culture.
Be mute. Yes, I believe that culture is really what brings us all together. However different we are, whatever different backgrounds, it's through culture that we learned to know each other. It's culture that creates a bridge. Now, obviously, all of us are active in the world of culture in one way or another, and culture is constantly evolving. And the key for us, or for any of us, especially those of us who have been in it for a long, long time, is never take anything for granted. We constantly have to question it, re-question it, and I think a conversation like the conversation today is precisely a part of the process of re-questioning everything and not taking things for granted. But I am an idealist, and I really believe that art, culture is lifting us all and brings us together as opposed to dividing us.
Moshtari?
To me, critical culture is two things. First of all, I think critical culture or being critical should go very far. It should question significance, and even if that means that you're insignificant in a certain space or in a certain debate, like you should dare to go to that place. And also, critical culture, living in a neoliberal world, should be more about the process. Like we shouldn't aim for a product, we shouldn't aim for a solution always, but respect the process. For me as an artist, I learn much more in the process of doing something than the actual opening of an exhibition or selling an artwork. So yeah, significance and process.
Lola? Sure.
My panelists?
Couldn't prepare.
I would say that for me, critical culture means to be kind to oneself, but to also be honest. It's like, again, not an easy process to basically confront the things about your history or where you've come from that have made you the way that you are today. Yeah, it's like a process that I'm still going through, and obviously I think a lot, and sometimes I find myself in a position where I talk myself out of a lot of ideas, a lot of artworks, a lot of just opportunities because I don't know how it'll be read, or I'm always in this state of like just hyper criticality of And also I think that also it has something to do with the fact that I exist in a body that has always had to, make other people comfortable before I can even begin to think or to be a part of the conversation. And these are all things that I'm like actively trying to reject now, is to not be, is to like know my boundaries and to enforce them when they're necessary, to be kind to myself as I kind of grow into who I am, to be kind to my neighbors and to the people that maybe I don't understand fully, to give what I can and to take what I need. And yeah, it's just still it's a process, but just I think kindness goes a long way, and we're all figuring things out. No one has like an answer book when it comes to how to live with each other. Life is just insane to already, like it's just like what's going on. So of course I can accept that we're not going to just like wake up in a utopia tomorrow. But as Mushtari said, the process to me is extremely gratifying and exciting and also terrifying. And I just want there to be space for all of that to exist, basically.
From critical culture to hyper-criticality, and I love it. Yeah, thank you so much for participating in this forum. This was really extremely interesting. Thank you.
Thank you so much for being on this panel. Thank you, all of you.